In the heart of the golden savannas, where the sun painted fire across the tall grass and the winds whispered tales of kings, there was born a lion unlike any other. His name was Kael. From the very beginning, his presence commanded attention, not just because of his powerful frame or the regal fire in his eyes, but because of something far deeper. There was a stillness to him, a calm dignity, as though he carried the weight of an ancient wisdom in his heart. Kael was the son of the reigning monarch, heir to the throne of a pride known for its ruthless dominance, feared across the plains. He was expected to inherit not only the land but the legacy, a dynasty of power built on fear, tradition, and conquest. But Kael did not fit the mold carved out for him by his bloodline. While other young lions pounced with aggression, eager to impress with raw brutality, Kael lingered at the edge of the chaos, watching, thinking, questioning. Where others hunted the weak to prove strength, Kael hesitated. He saw no honor in killing a calf separated from its mother or in striking down the injured who posed no threat. In moments when an elder lion lashed out at a smaller one for stepping out of line, Kael intervened, not with fury, but with reason. He shielded the vulnerable, defended the cubs who stumbled, and growled back when cruelty masqueraded as tradition. These actions, noble as they were, did not earn him respect among the elders. They whispered about him behind stone eyes and sharpened claws. They called him soft, unworthy, a shame to his father's name. The pride's laws were clear, their values carved in the dust by generations before. Mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. And so Kael's refusal to follow the unspoken rule of the jungle, to dominate without question, became his crime. Even his father, though quietly proud of Kael's heart, remained silent under the crushing gaze of tradition. To stand with his son would mean to challenge the very foundation of his rule, and so he did not speak when the verdict came. Kael was summoned before the circle of the pride, where the sky stretched heavy above them and the earth trembled with tension. The elders declared him a traitor, not to his pride's safety, but to its legacy. His values, they said, would weaken their bloodline, endanger their future. And so, under the same sky where he had once been hailed as the future king, Kael was stripped of his title. No ceremony, no farewell, only silence. The pride turned their backs as he walked away, each step sinking into the earth like a goodbye. But as Kael vanished into the horizon, alone and dishonored, he did not feel small. He did not feel broken. He knew the truth that burned steady within him. He was not cast out because he was weak. He was cast out because he chose to be strong in a way the world refused to understand. In the wide, sun-drenched savanna, where the tall grass whispered the stories of kings and killers, a young lion named Kael stood at the edge of his world. Even as a cub, Kael had always carried something different in his eyes, not the wild hunger for dominance that stirred in the hearts of the others, but something quieter, deeper. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't fear, it was awareness. While his brothers wrestled for the right to roar louder or bite harder, Kael watched the wind, studied the sky, listened to the silence between the chaos. He was strong, his muscles lean and powerful, his instincts sharp, but strength alone had never interested him. He wanted to understand the why behind the roar, the purpose behind the kill, and that, in a pride built on legacy and blood, made him dangerous. To the others, Kael's nature was an irritation. His refusal to taunt the small or finish off the injured was confusing. He questioned too much. He hesitated when instinct demanded action. They began to mock him behind his back, calling him a shadow lion, present but not fierce enough to claim the sun. The elders watched with cold eyes, whispering that Kael's softness was a threat to tradition, a curse that could unravel the savage order that had held for generations. Even the lionesses, wise and weary from years of survival, began to turn their gazes elsewhere. Kael didn't belong, and yet he refused to bend. That quiet defiance echoed louder than any roar. Then came the day that would fracture everything. It began with dust, rising in columns as the Pride launched into a coordinated hunt. The target, a small herd of gazelles grazing near the dry riverbed. The Pride moved as one, silent, swift, ruthless. Kael joined them, his paws brushing through brittle grass, every muscle poised, every breath aligned with the earth. He did not like the hunt, but he respected it. He understood survival. What he didn't understand, what he never could accept, was cruelty. As the Pride charged, the herd scattered in wild panic. Kael surged forward with the others, but as he rounded a bend in the terrain, he saw something that stopped him cold. A newborn gazelle, legs trembling, had fallen behind in the chaos. It was alone, its front leg bent grotesquely beneath its body, struggling to rise. The others didn't see it or didn't care. The cub was an easy kill, an effortless trophy for any lion looking to prove dominance. Kael stood over it, heart pounding. The cub's eyes met his, wide with fear and the kind of helplessness that stripped away species and instinct. In that moment, Kael didn't see prey. He saw innocence. He saw his own younger self, the weak moments he had hidden from everyone. He saw life, and so he did the unthinkable. He bent down, gently took the cub by the scruff, not to kill, but to carry, and walked away. He crossed the dry riverbed, careful with every step, his ears tuned to the wind behind him. No lion followed. Only silence, like the savannah itself was holding its breath. On the far side, beneath a tree bent with age, Kael laid the cub in the grass, away from the path of the hunt. The tiny creature looked up at him, still trembling, but alive. Kael gave one last glance toward the herd, then turned and walked back to face the Pride. They were waiting. The elders stood like statues, manes rippling in the breeze, eyes narrow and unforgiving. The other lions gathered in a loose circle behind them, some confused, some quietly amused, some already looking away as though they didn't want to be seen. At the center was his father, Veron, the great alpha, massive, scarred, and silent. Kael approached with a steady pace, his head held high. Before a single word was spoken, he knew what was coming. "You abandoned your role," one elder growled, stepping forward. "You turned your back on the hunt." Kael's voice was calm, but resolute. "I chose not to kill what could not defend itself," the elder snarled. "That wasn't a choice. That was betrayal. You disrespected our ways, our legacy. A lion who spares the weak weakens us all." Murmurs rippled through the Pride. Kael turned to face them, his eyes scanning the familiar faces, peers he'd grown beside, cubs he had protected, lionesses who had once sung his name to the stars. Now none would meet his gaze. Another elder stepped forward, his mane flecked with grey. "You've always walked a different path, Kael, but this was defiance. Mercy is for prey. A lion who shows it invites ruin." Kael looked to his father. Veron's gaze was unreadable. There was something in his eyes, something wounded, but his face remained hard. Kael took a breath. "There is no honor in killing the helpless. If we are strong, it must be for something. Otherwise, we are nothing more than hunger with teeth." The wind shifted. The elders exchanged glances. One nodded. "The council has spoken," the lead elder announced. "You are no longer one of us. From this moment your bloodline is broken. Your name will not be remembered in our stories. You walk alone." Kael didn't move. For a heartbeat the savannah was utterly still. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to his father one last time, waiting, hoping. But Veron said nothing. He did not protest. He did not speak. He only looked away. That was the deepest cut, No one roared, no one growled. The sentence was carried out not with fury, but with silence. Kael turned. The circle of lions parted as he walked. Not one looked at him. Not even Lyra, his sister, who had once curled beside him on stormy nights and whispered dreams of a different world. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground. Each step Kael took felt heavier than the last. The sky darkened above, the wind carrying the faint cries of vultures far away. Behind him, the world he had known, his home, his blood, disappeared like smoke. He did not run. He did not weep. At the edge of the ridge, where the sun touched the horizon like an ember fading into ash, Kael stopped. He looked back once, just once, and then faced the open world. With the pride behind him and the unknown ahead, Kael let out a roar, not loud, not furious, but deep, mournful, and true. It echoed across the plain like a question asked to the stars and answered by no one. The sun was behind him now. Kael walked toward nothing, no pride, no path, just an endless horizon of earth and silence. The grasslands he once ruled faded into memory, replaced by barren plains where nothing moved but the wind. With every step, the ground beneath him changed, from cracked clay to shifting sand, from jagged rock to icy ridges. He walked through deserts where the sun baked his paws raw, his shadow stretched long behind him like a ghost that wouldn't leave. He climbed mountains whose peaks sliced the sky, the wind biting through his mane like knives, and he crossed through storms so wild the rain felt like the sky was weeping with him. Alone, he pressed on. Hunger was his first companion. Days passed where he found nothing but dry bones and wind. His ribs began to show beneath his fur, and his once mighty stride slowed to a stagger. But still, Kael did not beg the land for mercy. He accepted it. He hunted when he could, scavenged when he must, and when there was nothing, he endured. Nights brought cold and pain. Cuts reopened, muscles screamed. His breath turned to fog against the stars, and still he pressed forward. He faced jackals, desperate and wild, who tried to steal what little he found. He faced snakes that struck from underfoot. A crocodile lunged from the edge of a river once, nearly dragging him under. And he fought, not for glory, just to keep moving. His body bore the proof. A scar above his eye, a limp in his back right leg that never fully healed, his mane, once thick and flawless, now matted with dust and dried blood. But he never looked at his wounds with hatred. Every mark told a story, every limp held a lesson. He did not become bitter. He became quiet. His roar, once proud, once meant to shake the plains, became something else entirely. At night, under a sky full of cold stars, Kael would sit on some high ridge or beneath the skeletal branches of a tree, and he would roar, but not like before. It wasn't a roar to stake claim, or to threaten, or to prove strength. It was a sound born of grief and grit, a deep, aching call to the universe, asking only to be heard. There were no ears to answer, only the wind, the trees, the sky. But he roared anyway. It became his ritual. Each night after surviving one more day, he would give his voice to the sky, a roar to say, "I'm still here. I haven't given up. I may be alone, but I am not lost." And in that, something strange began to grow. Not comfort, not peace, but understanding. In the silence that followed his cries, Kael began to listen, not to others, but to himself. Every painful step, every cold night, every growl in his empty stomach became part of a conversation with his own soul. In the absence of noise, he found clarity. In the wild, he was no longer performing. There were no elders to impress, no pride to disappoint. There was only truth. And slowly, without realizing it, Kael began to change. His heart, once bruised by rejection, now beat steady with resolve. His mind, once clouded by the need to belong, now open to a larger purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning. He was watching how the desert bloomed after rain, how a bird could build a nest in the thorns, how the stars always returned after the storm. And though he never wrote words, his roars became a kind of journal, each one filled with what he'd learned, what he'd lost, what he still hoped to find. There were nights when he would remember their faces, the ones who turned away, his sister's downcast eyes, his father's silence. The sting of exile never left him completely, but instead of letting it poison him, Kael held it like a stone, heavy, yes, but grounding, a reminder. Not of betrayal, but of the choice he made, a choice to protect the weak, to walk with honor, even when it cost him everything. So he kept walking, through lands no lion had claimed, through winds that howled like the ghosts of the past, through solitude that would have broken others, but not Kael. He was no longer just a lion without a pride. He was becoming something more, something deeper, something truer. Each roar, each scar, each night alone beneath the stars was shaping him. The world had tried to take everything from him, his home, his name, his future, but Kael still had one thing no one could touch, his soul. And that soul was learning to sing. The wind carried the scent before he heard the cries. Kael's ears twitched and he stopped mid-step, his body tensing against the quiet sway of the grass. It was faint at first, just a shift in the air, a disturbance in the pattern of sound that the wild usually followed. But then it came again, sharp and desperate, a snarl, followed by a high-pitched wail. Not far, a lioness, and a cub. His paws gripped the earth as instinct surged within him, a flood of tension racing through old wounds. He had faced danger alone for moons now. He had learned to pick his battles, to preserve his strength. There was no pride to protect anymore, no one to impress. He could walk away. He had every reason to. But the scream came again, closer now, desperate, terrified. Kael turned toward it without another thought. He ran. Through the thorns that tore at his legs, over roots and dry stone, his breath steady, his body moving like it remembered what it meant to protect. As he crested the hill, he saw them, 4 hyenas circling, their laughter cruel and sharp as they crept in closer. In the center stood a lioness, bleeding from her shoulder, panting hard, teeth bared. Her cub, no more than a few weeks old, cowered behind her, his tiny frame shaking with every hiss of the wind. The lioness lashed out as one of the hyenas snapped at her flank, but she was already tiring. They were toying with her, waiting for her to break. Kael didn't pause. He roared. The sound cracked through the air like thunder, echoing down the valley. The hyenas froze for half a heartbeat before turning. Their eyes widened as they saw him, scarred, dust-covered, his mane torn from wind and war. But there was fire in him. Not rage, not madness. Purpose. Kael was a storm that had walked too long in silence, and now it had teeth. The first hyena lunged, and Kael met it mid-air, jaws locking around its neck. Blood sprayed the grass as the creature yelped and fell limp. Another darted in from the side, biting deep into Kael's leg, but he swung around, his claws tearing through fur and bone. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He was not fighting for himself. He was fighting for something pure again, something that mattered. The third and fourth hyenas circled, more cautious now. Kael stood between them and the lioness, blood dripping from his mouth, his chest heaving. They came at once, one from behind, one from the front. He took a bite to the shoulder, but managed to catch the other by the throat, slamming it into the ground. The last hyena bit deep into his side, but Kael twisted, grabbed its leg, and flung it against a tree with a sickening crack. And then silence. Kael stood in the clearing, surrounded by blood and broken bodies. His legs trembled beneath him, his breath short and ragged. Every wound screamed, every heartbeat felt stolen. He stumbled once, knees buckling, but caught himself before falling. He turned slowly toward the lioness and her cub. She stared at him, stunned, her own breath caught between fear and awe. Blood dripped from her wound, but her eyes remained fixed on him, not with suspicion, but with something else, something softer. Gratitude, reverence. The cub peeked out from behind her, eyes wide, taking in the sight of the lion who had faced death not for power, not for pride, but for them. Kael didn't speak. He only lowered his head and began to limp away, his body spent, the pain catching up with him all at once. "Wait," the lioness called. He paused. "You saved us," she said. He turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers. "You had no one else." "I didn't expect anyone," she whispered. Kael offered nothing more. He had done what he came to do. That was enough. But she stepped forward. "You're hurt." "It'll heal," he replied, though his side pulsed with heat and the world tilted slightly under his feet. She moved beside him, allowing her cub to settle safely beneath her body. "I'm Zara." Kael nodded faintly. Kael. They walked together that night, not as strangers, but not yet companions. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Two creatures who had known loneliness intimately, learning how to be near someone again. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the land in gold and violet, they had reached a narrow stream. Kael collapsed beside it, drinking slowly. Zara sat close, keeping watch as her cub dozed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Zara asked quietly, "Why are you alone?" Kael stared at his reflection in the water. "Because I chose to do what my pride considered wrong." What was that? "I spared the weak. I protected those they saw as prey. I was banished for compassion." His voice didn't waver. There was no bitterness, only fact. Zara looked at him, truly looked. The scars, the quiet strength, the way he didn't boast about the battle, didn't demand to be praised or pitied. "Maybe the pride didn't deserve you," she said softly. Kael turned his gaze toward her. For a moment, the weight in his chest lightened, not because the pain was gone, but because someone had finally seen him and understood. Zara smiled just slightly. "Rest. I'll keep watch." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Kael allowed himself to close his eyes, not because he was safe, but because someone else was willing to stand in the silence with him, not as a follower, not as a judge, but as an equal. In the days that followed, Kael's wounds began to heal, but something deeper stirred within him, something that hadn't moved in a long time. With Zara and her cub beside him, the silence that had once clung to him like a second skin began to soften. He still spoke little, but his presence no longer felt like a shadow. It had weight. It had meaning. They traveled together through valleys where the air smelled of rain and old battles. They hunted, rested, moved again, each day a little stronger, each night a little less lonely. Zara was quiet too, but she had strength. Not the kind Kael had once been taught to admire, not the loud, snarling kind, but a quieter fire, steady and stubborn. She had been hunted, wounded and left to die, but she hadn't. She had protected her cub with everything she had. That mattered. That meant something. Over time, Kael began to see her not just as a survivor, but as a mirror, a soul who had been broken by the world, but never defeated by it. They began to notice others. It started with a limping jackal, too thin to stand properly, trembling near the edge of a dry creek bed. It should have run from them, but it didn't. It couldn't. Zara stepped forward first, cautious, her cub held back behind her. The jackal made no move, just watched them with dull, empty eyes. Kael approached slowly, lowered his head. He could smell starvation, fear, old wounds. He didn't walk away. They brought the jackal food, stayed close but not too close. It didn't speak, but it didn't leave either. By morning it was following them at a distance. Then came the crippled vulture, a bent wing, feathers missing. It fell from a low branch as they passed. Kael could have ignored it. In his old life it would have been prey. But this time he looked down at the bird struggling in the dirt and simply said, "You'll fly again." He meant it. It wasn't long before the 3 became 5, and then more. A fox with one blind eye, a wild dog with half a tail and a crooked spine, an old tortoise nearly crushed by a falling log but still moving forward, inch by inch. They were the unwanted, the overlooked, the lost. Some followed from afar, too scared to draw close. Others joined them outright. There was no ceremony, no claim, no rules. Kael never declared himself anything. He simply existed among them, and they came. He didn't create a pride. He couldn't. A pride was rigid, ancient, built on dominance and fear. What they were becoming had no name at first, but it was something more honest, a gathering of souls who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to believe in one another. Kael didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. When he hunted, they watched. When he shared his kill with the smallest, they learned. When he stood between danger and the weak, they followed. Not because he demanded it, but because he never asked. He taught them to hunt, not just to feed themselves, but to feed others. He showed them how to work together, how to corner without cruelty, how to take only what was needed, how to leave space for life to continue. When one of the younger animals asked why he didn't roar at his enemies anymore, Kael answered simply, "Because not every roar needs to be a warning. Sometimes it's a promise." The days grew into weeks. The group moved like a tide now, still scattered, but together. They built nothing permanent, but their bond was more solid than stone. They didn't live by hierarchy. There were no alphas, no lesser beasts, only survivors, willing to walk side by side. Zara became his equal. She was sharper than him in many ways. Where Kael was silent, she spoke. Where Kael stepped back to observe, she stepped forward to act. They balanced each other, 2 sides of a coin neither of them had ever asked to carry. Her cub, now stronger, began to mimic Kael's walk, his stillness, even his silences. It was strange, watching something new form from the broken pieces of old lives. Strange, but right. The turning point came on a night thick with rain. Thunder rolled low and slow across the sky. Most of the group had taken shelter beneath a ridge, huddled close. Kael stood watch, eyes scanning the dark, senses alert. That's when he heard it, a faint cry, almost lost in the wind. He followed the sound to a grove of trees, where he found a porcupine with a crushed paw and eyes wide with pain. It tried to defend itself, but there was no strength left. Kael sat beside it, didn't touch it, didn't force help, just waited. After a long while, the porcupine stopped shaking. "You shouldn't help me," it said weakly. "I've done nothing for you." Kael's voice was barely above the rain. "You don't help because someone earned it. You help because you can." The porcupine didn't respond, but it stayed. By dawn, it had joined them. That became Kael's way, not a leader who ordered, but a protector who inspired. His tribe, as they came to be called, not by him, but by others, grew into something the jungle had never seen. Not built on fear, but trust. Not on power, but on purpose. He watched a once starving fox teach a squirrel how to spot snakes. He saw a jackal give up its meal for an injured rabbit. He watched a blind owl guide a limping warthog by sound alone. things no one would have believed if they hadn't seen them with their own eyes. And yet it happened, over and over again. Kael walked through them not as a king, not as a savior, but as a reminder that even those cast out can build something beautiful. There were moments when he still ached, when the memory of his old pride returned like a cold wind. But when he heard laughter now, it wasn't cruel. It was real. When he heard roars, they weren't battles, they were songs. And sometimes when the moon was high and the world quieted, he would climb a hill and roar into the night. A deep, steady sound, no longer filled with sorrow. Now it was filled with meaning. He didn't need to be remembered in stories. He had become one. The rains had not come for many moons. The sky above Kael's new home was still blue, but even it carried the weight of distant storms that refused to fall. Winds travelled across the plains differently now, bringing not only the scent of far-off fires and cracked earth, but something more, something familiar. A vulture passed overhead, low and circling, and Kael's ears twitched at the distant cries carried by the wind. Rumours travelled in the wild, whispered between the trees, in the silence of empty riverbeds, and in the hurried footsteps of animals migrating too soon. The old pride, his pride, was suffering. The stories came in fragments at first. A lone hyena, too weak to threaten anyone, collapsed near their camp. Before it slipped into unconsciousness, it muttered through cracked lips about the great drought, about how the earth in Kael's birthplace had split open and swallowed life whole. The once rich plains were now bone dry, the waterholes reduced to mud, and the tall grasses that once hid prey now stood brittle and dead. Disease had followed, first among the gazelle, then the lionesses. Cubs born sick didn't survive. The strong grew lean, the old perished. The kingdom that once roared had been reduced to quiet suffering. But it wasn't just nature that had turned its back. Enemies had moved in, sensing weakness. A coalition of rogue lions had begun circling the territory like vultures. Jackals had become bolder. Even the elephants, once indifferent, had begun trampling paths through what was left of the pride's borders, no longer avoiding confrontation. The land Kael had once known, the place that had cast him out for mercy, was now being torn apart by the very forces it once believed it could dominate. Zara was the first to speak what the others wouldn't. They had gathered around a small fire as dusk fell, the wind restless and dry. "It's them, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes on Kael. Kael didn't answer at first. He stared into the flames, the orange glow flickering against his weathered face. His scars caught the light like old memories rising to the surface. "The pride," Zara said again, more certain now. "They're the ones suffering." "Your family," Kael exhaled slowly. "They were my family once." Zara shifted closer, her voice softer. "You've heard the stories. You know what's happening. Their land is dying. They're being overrun, and they're being led by—" Kael finished for her. "My brother." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was a quiet resignation. His younger brother, Thorn, had always been the golden one, loud, fearless, admired by the elders for his aggression and appetite for conquest. Where Kael had questioned, Thorn had obeyed. Where Kael had protected the weak, Thorn had hunted them for sport. It was Thorn who had stood behind the council as Kael was cast out. It was Thorn who had smirked when Kael turned to their father and found nothing but silence. Thorn had inherited the throne not through wisdom, but through compliance, and now he led a kingdom crumbling under his rule. Zara watched Kael carefully. "Will you go back, even after what they did to you?" Kael's gaze lifted from the fire to the distant hills. The wind tugged at his mane. For a long time he said nothing. Then he spoke, not with bitterness, not with pride, but with something deeper, something unshakable. "You don't help others because they deserve it," he said. "You help because you can." The words settled into the earth around them. No one argued, no one asked more. In that moment, everyone knew what was coming next. By sunrise, Kael was gone. He didn't ask anyone to follow. He didn't need them to. This wasn't a war or a crusade. It was a journey back into the heart of everything he had lost. A return to the place that had broken him, not to reclaim a throne or settle a score, but to offer what little he had to give. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but help. The lands he crossed on the way back were barely recognizable. What had once been rich with color and movement was now dry and grey. The bones of fallen animals littered the path like forgotten stories. The rivers had thinned to veins. The trees stood bare, like ghosts from his childhood. Every step closer felt like walking through a memory, slowly turning to dust. And then, one evening, just as the light faded behind the cliffs, Kael crested a hill and saw it, his old pride. What was left of it? The den site, once alive with roars and laughter and the thunder of cubs chasing one another, now lay quiet. A few lionesses lay near the rocks, too weak to rise, their coats dull, their eyes sunken. The cubs were few, and those that remained clung to their mothers with trembling paws. A foul stench hung in the air, disease, rot, despair. He descended slowly. There was no roar to announce his return, no pride to answer him. But as he drew near, a familiar voice rose from the shadows. "Did you come to watch us die, brother?" Kael turned. Thorn stood atop a rock ledge, thinner now, but still holding himself as if the world owed him its attention. His eyes flashed with the same arrogance Kael remembered, but it was cracked now, worn down by failure. Kael didn't answer. Thorn climbed down to face him, his steps uneven. "I should have known you'd come. Word travels fast in the wild. The great outcast, the lion who roars for the broken. Come to save us, have you?" Kael looked past him, at the others watching from the shadows. Their faces were not angry. They were tired, hollow, hoping perhaps, fearing definitely. "I came," Kael said, "because no one else did." Thorn sneered. "You think they'll follow you now? After everything? You were cast out. You're not one of us." "I don't need to be," Kael said calmly. "This isn't about me. It's about all of you. The sick, the starving, the cubs. I didn't come for power. I came with water, with food, with help." Behind him, in the fading light, shapes began to appear. Zara, leading a group of lions and outcasts from Kael's tribe. They carried what they could: herbs, fresh kills, skins filled with clean water, the old fox, the tortoise, even the jackal. They had followed, after all, not because Kael had called them, but because they believed in what he stood for. Thorn watched in silence as they moved through the pride, offering help without judgment. A lioness collapsed into Zara's arms. A cub took food from the jackal's paw without flinching. Kael turned back to Thorn. "You led with fear," he said. "I'll lead with something else." Thorn didn't respond. He didn't roar. He didn't fight. Because in that moment, even he saw the truth. Kael hadn't come back to reclaim what was lost. He had come to remind them what was possible. As the stars emerged overhead and the fire was lit at the center of the den, Kael stood among lions who had once turned their backs on him, not with a crown, not with revenge, just with a steady heart and the quiet strength to stay. And for the first time in a long, long while, they didn't look away. The sun was beginning to dip low over the horizon, spilling golden light across the cracked and thirsty earth. The once mighty kingdom, Kael's birthplace, lay quiet, its silence louder than any roar. Lions who had once stood proud now moved like shadows, gaunt and slow, their strength lost to time, drought, and hopelessness. Cubs huddled beneath their mothers, eyes dull, ribs pressing against their thin skin. The proud roars of old had become whispers, the mighty had become weary, and into that silence came a sound unlike anything the plains had heard in many moons, not a roar, but a ripple of movement, a procession. Kael stood at the head of it. Behind him came his tribe, not a pride of blood, but of choice. Lions and lionesses once discarded, animals once feared or forgotten. The jackal with the crooked spine carried bundles of dried meat and roots in a sling across his back. The vulture, now healed, flew overhead, calling to the skies. Zara walked beside Kael, her cub at her side, carrying a skin full of water between her jaws. They came not with weapons, not with teeth bared. They came with gifts, with help. As they descended the ridge, the lions of Kael's old pride rose slowly, blinking against the light, not sure if what they were seeing was real. The lion they had exiled, the one they had left behind, the one who had walked into the wilderness and vanished. He had returned, not broken, not bitter, but strong, wiser, whole. He bore scars, yes, but none of them had made him cruel. Words spread like fire in dry grass. Elders stepped forward, unsure. Mothers pulled their cubs close. Some of the young lions, born after his exile, watched him with wide, awestruck eyes. They had heard stories of the outcast, of the lion who spared the weak, who roared into the night sky alone, but none had ever imagined he would return. And then, slowly, the old king emerged. Kael's father, Veron, stepped from the shadows of the central den. He was smaller now. His mane, once thick and golden, had thinned and faded to grey. His steps were slow, his body trembling with age, but his eyes, those same solemn eyes Kael remembered, were filled with something new. Not pride, not authority, but sorrow. They stared at each other for a long time. No words, just the wind. Then Veron lowered his head, not as a king, not as a father, but as a lion who had made a terrible mistake. Tears welled at the corners of his eyes, and his voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. I was wrong. The world seemed to pause. The elders froze. The lionesses gasped. Never had the great Veron bowed to anyone, not in battle, not in council, not even to time. But here he was before his son, shoulders hunched, eyes wet. I should have spoken, he said, trembling. I should have stood by you when they turned. I watched you walk away and said nothing. I thought I was protecting the order. I thought silence was strength. But I was wrong, Kael. I was wrong about you. Kael stepped forward, slowly, carefully, until he stood face to face with the lion who had once let him fall. I don't need your apology, Kael said quietly. I didn't come for revenge. I came because there are cubs here who won't survive another week without water. I came because your lionesses are too weak to hunt, because your kingdom is dying, and I can help. Veron could only nod, his head still bowed. Then help us, he whispered, not as a king, not as an heir, just as a lion. Kael turned to his tribe, gave a short signal, and they moved swiftly. Water was poured into the cracked basins of stone, food shared without hesitation. The injured were tended to, herbs placed gently on open wounds. The cubs were the first to come forward, drawn not by fear, but by curiosity, and then by joy. They drank, ate, played. The old pride watched, slowly rising, slowly approaching. There were no questions now, no rules, no need for old customs, only gratitude. And then Kael climbed the rise. He stood at the very spot where he had once been judged, once been exiled. The same stone where the elders had pronounced his banishment now held his silent weight. The plains stretched before him, wide and open. His eyes scanned the land, not with ambition, not with longing, but with truth. He breathed in deeply, and then he roared. It wasn't loud at first. It didn't come from his throat. It came from somewhere deeper, his soul. It was not a roar of power or anger or pain. It was a roar of clarity, of purpose, of everything he had seen and survived, of the lion he had become. It rose slowly, gathering strength, shaking the dust from the trees and startling birds into the air. It moved like thunder across the valley, curling through the canyons, echoing down into the dry riverbeds. It was a roar that said, "I am still here. I never needed your crown. I never needed your approval. I have walked through fire and never lost myself. I am not your outcast. I am your truth." The roar shook the plains, and one by one the lions who had once turned their backs began to bow, not in fear, not in submission, but in respect. The elders lowered their heads. The lionesses did too. Even Thorn, who had stood quietly near the back, unable to speak, now sank to his knees, his pride shattered by the weight of what he was witnessing. Kael turned to them, not to claim a throne. He had no interest in crowns. What he wanted had never been power. He wanted dignity, peace, balance. And now, finally, he saw it reflected in their eyes. He descended the rock and walked into the pride, not as a ruler, not as a savior, but as one of them. They made space for him, not out of obligation, but willingly. The pride had remembered something it had forgotten long ago, that strength is not the loudest roar or the sharpest claw. Sometimes strength is the one who walks away. Sometimes it's the one who comes back, and sometimes it's the one who forgives. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting the land in firelight, Kael sat among them. The cubs leaned against him. The lionesses rested beside him. His tribe, his family of misfits and survivors, mingled freely with the lions who once called him Exile. No one called him king, but all knew what he was. He was Kael, the lion who roared alone, and the roar that shook the plains would be remembered, not as a challenge, not as a war cry, but as the moment the wild found its heart again. The sun rose slowly over the savannah, bathing the land in a soft gold that bled into every corner of the sky. The grass swayed gently with the morning wind, whispering secrets across the plains. Kael stood alone at the edge of the den site, just beyond where the stones gave way to open earth. Behind him the pride stirred quietly, tired but fed, weak but healing. There was laughter again among the cubs, and for the first time in moons there was no hunger in their eyes. Lionesses cleaned their young. The injured rested in peace. Zara's tribe, now fully interwoven into the pride's daily rhythm, moved with quiet purpose, bridging the space between strangers once divided by fear. Kael watched all of it from a distance, not with regret, but with understanding. He had not come here to reclaim anything, not to rule, not to rebuild what had cast him out. He had come because he could not stand by while others suffered. That had always been his truth. He had walked back into the jaws of history and turned it into hope. But now it was time to go. He padded slowly through the den site, past lions who lowered their heads as he passed, not in submission, but in reverence. They didn't ask him to stay. They didn't need to. They understood now that Kael's spirit was not one to be caged by walls, even those built from love. He had always been meant for the wind, the horizon, the unseen road. Veron stood waiting at the outer edge, his old eyes soft. The once great king looked smaller than Kael remembered, but there was peace in his stance now. "You could stay," he said, voice quiet, almost hesitant. Kael paused beside him, then looked out toward the hills. "I don't belong here." "You've earned a place." "I have a place," Kael replied gently. "It's just not this one." Veron nodded. He didn't argue. Perhaps long ago he would have, but not now. Now he understood that Kael's strength had never been about territory or titles. It had always come from something far rarer: honor. Zara approached next, her cub trotting beside her, eyes bright. They didn't speak right away. She looked into his eyes and saw what he wasn't saying, and she smiled. "We'll be waiting," she said simply. Kael's expression softened. He touched his nose briefly to her brow, then turned without ceremony, without farewell songs or roaring farewells, and began walking back the way he had come. Step by step, the pride behind him grew smaller in the distance. The past remained where it belonged, and the future waited where it always had, in the unknown. The days that followed were quiet. Kael returned to the hills, to the trails only he knew, the rivers he had once slept beside, the trees that had shaded his thoughts. And slowly, one by one, his tribe began to gather again. The jackal was first, his crooked spine now a badge of resilience. The vulture flew in next, spiraling once before landing near Kael with a knowing nod. Zara and her cub arrived not long after, followed by the others, outcasts, wanderers, broken things made whole by belief, not blood. They didn't ask where he had been. They didn't need the story, because they already knew it. But far beyond Kael's quiet return, the world had begun to change. Word of what happened in the Great Pride spread not like gossip, but like wildfire. Whispers carried by birds, stories passed from den to den, watering hole to watering hole, first among the jackals, then the hyenas, then the elephants and the wild dogs and the zebras. Not a tale of conquest or of blood, but of something greater, of a lion who had been cast out for showing mercy, who had chosen honor over hate, who had walked alone but returned not with vengeance, only with compassion. They told of how he faced death to protect those who could not fight, how he chose exile over cruelty, how he saved the very lions who once turned their backs, and how, when the pride offered him everything, status, crown, submission, he walked away. He became more than a story. He became a legend, the lion who roared alone, not because he couldn't belong, but because he had chosen a different kind of belonging, one born not of fear but of truth. As the seasons passed, his name was spoken with reverence across the kingdom, not shouted, not worshipped, but remembered. Cubs sat wide-eyed as their mothers told them of the scarred lion with the steady eyes who walked with outcasts and protected the weak. Elders who once scorned mercy now told of its power. Predators thought twice before taking a life they did not need. The wild began to shift, not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the sky was heavy and the moon full, a single roar could be heard across the plains. Not the roar of conquest, not the roar of rage, but the deep, steady voice of Kael, a promise, a reminder, a song. And on one such night, high on a cliff where the land met the sky, Kael stood alone. The wind played gently with his mane, and the stars blinked above him, listening. He looked out over everything, the hills, the rivers, the wild he had wandered, the scars he had earned, the souls he had saved. No crowds, no crown, only peace, only truth. His eyes softened as he watched the moonlight shimmer across the plains below. So many lives, each one fragile, so much pain, and yet so much beauty. He stood there as the breeze whispered around him, carrying with it echoes of the stories told in his name. And as the camera slowly pulled back, the voice of the narrator spoke one final time. In a world where being kind is mistaken for weakness, may you remember Kael, the lion who roared alone, and changed everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's ever stood alone for what's right. Let them know they were never truly alone. And if you believe the world needs more stories that roar from the soul, subscribe to the Roarthinker, because sometimes a single voice can echo across the wild and change everything.